What do you worry about more? Things you did in the past or things that might happen in the future? I'm a worrier. I'm less bothered by things that already happened and the mistakes and gaffes that I've made, and there's plenty of those, than the fear of things in the future. My mind swirls with a mix of improbable outcomes for even the happiest of things. I often think that to every silver lining is a nearby storm cloud. When I plan things, I almost instinctively build in B and C scenarios. Now, this tendency to plan for the worst, once in a rare while, served me well. Things do sometimes go wrong, and when they do, and I am prepared, it reinforces my sense that through this planning, I'm doing something right. But the truth is that the things I fear only seldom come to pass. They are out of my control, and no amount of worrying will change that. Even this knowledge, though, doesn't help much. As I write this paragraph, in fact, I'm worried that I'll muff up the podcast delivery. Why would I worry about such a thing when this would have no actual consequences outside of another 3 minutes of audio editing? What's wrong with me? You're listening to Happiness and the Pursuit of the Good Life, a podcast about ancient wisdom, modern psychology, and the search for a life that is not only successful, but meaningful. I'm Michael Sadlow. Today, why do we worry, and can more detachment help? What's wrong with me is simply that I'm human. It is true that we all worry and carry anxiety to different degrees. But our psychological tendencies, simply as human beings, to worry are high, far higher, than our propensity toward happiness. This is easy to understand from an evolutionary perspective. Like all living organisms, we're built with the primary directive of living. We constantly look for signs of danger, like the saber-toothed tiger, or enemy from a rival clan waiting to harm us. Our reflexes are slow and natural means of defense weak. All we have are our wits and our clan. So too, we know that winter will come and crops will stop growing and food will become scarcer, and so our sense of fear of the future leads us to plan so we can get through to the next year. Worrying in such an environment is the difference between life and death. Our drive toward pleasure, reproduction, and just a general sense of well-being are not unimportant, but they take a second seat to the more pressing need of survival. Our social circumstances today are vastly different from those of long ago ancestors, and yet from an evolutionary perspective, we have hardly budged. We still need to worry today. Communities and countries continue to face mortal threats. I would much rather have a pessimistic worrier than a happy glad-hander as the defense minister or spy master of my country. We, especially women, sometimes find ourselves alone in strange and dangerous places where worry is called for as a means of anticipating and reacting to potential dangers. There is plenty of real danger still in the world, and in such cases, worry helps us to get through to the other side. But most of us spend most of our time in environments in which mortal danger does not frequently loom around the corner. We have challenges, to be sure, but they rarely have catastrophic results. Although I go through phases of checking my email constantly, I almost never find a message to which responding quickly results in any benefit. And in the few cases where I do, delaying that response by a few hours or even days or weeks will not result in loss of my job, my house, or my family. I know this, and yet continue to do it out of a combination of fear and anticipation of one of those rare messages of good news that brings a shot of dopamine. Social media is built to exploit these psychological systems at an exponential level, increasing the anxiety levels of many of its users. We do not need to turn to modern technological innovation, though, to grasp the essential mismatch between our psychological responses and the cultural context in which we live. Thinkers long ago diagnosed the problem. I will spend the rest of this podcast exploring the diagnoses and the proposed solutions, mainly of two groups, the Stoics and the Buddhists. They each provide a version of the same answer, which I will term detachment. By that, I mean a stance that recognizes that most human suffering comes from worry, which is a state of mind. As a state of mind or consciousness, it is not real. It may be difficult to change, but ultimately, we can exert some control over our thoughts. We reduce suffering by detaching from the thought that is causing the suffering. Life is thus best led at a distance, maybe physical, but certainly mental, from our normal day-to-day frustrations. Detachment will serve as our fourth and final paradigm of the good life, complementing pleasure, virtue, and service. It is perhaps the hardest to embody, but it does offer valuable lessons. We may not aspire to the life of a Tibetan monk any more than we would aspire to the lives of Rihanna, Nelson Mandela, or Mother Teresa, but we might have something to learn from that life. Let's start with the Stoics. Stoicism began around the year 300 BCE in Athens. From its earliest articulations, Stoics wrestled with the question of how humans can or should be in the world. In their understanding, the world was a single living organism driven by the logos, by which they meant a kind of divine reason. Because the world was governed by reason, it was both highly ordered and fated. That is, reason, as it was understood then, leads in only one direction with one answer. Humans are inextricably bound to this world and thus also subject to the fate of the logos. The philosophical problem, of course, is the classic one of free will. If we are but tiny parts of a cosmos that is being inexorably and unchangeably driven by the logos, do we have any agency or free will? In answer to this question, these early Stoics made a critical distinction between what is governed by fate and what is not. Most things are governed by fate. Our health, whether we will be rich or poor, or what happens to us in the course of a day. But we are still left with a tiny domain in which we can exercise agency, that of our judgments. We, not fate, are in control of how we perceive and react to the swirling events around us. Like Aristotle, the Stoics thought that we must order our lives based on reason, and that reason leads to virtue. Living the good life of eudaimonia means living in accord with our reason, which in turn drives us to value the virtues. Yet in two major respects, the Stoic model differs from Aristotle's. First, Aristotle acknowledges that certain material requirements are necessary for the good life. It isn't possible to lead the good life if you don't have enough food to eat or have no friends. This isn't true for the Stoics, though. Your judgments, how you understand and process the data that comes in from your senses, are entirely in your control. The good life is dependent on your proper exercise of reason and deep understanding of how much of life is outside of your control. For the Stoics, even if you have no money and no friends, are a slave or in some other horrendously wretched situation, you can still live the good life. How, though, can a slave lead the good life? Isn't that just a kind of definitional jujitsu in which we completely change the meaning of the good life? Here is the second major difference between Aristotle and the Stoics. For Aristotle, the passions, primal feelings like lust, desire, anger, and fear, are natural and must be tempered through reason. Our job is to use reason to transform the passions of worry and recklessness into the virtue of courage. For the Stoics, though, the passions are not natural. They instead result from false judgment. The idea that a passion that we would regard as natural, such as sexual attraction or lust, is actually the result of a false judgment is hardly intuitive. A Stoic, though, would think like this. You perceive somebody attractive. Rationally, you know that the only true good is virtue. Beauty and sex are, on their own, morally neutral, or indifferent. They have no value, either good or bad. Yet when you see the attractive person, you make the false judgment that sex with that person would be good. This false judgment generates and inflames the passion of lust. Lust is the result of a cognitive exercise. Now, this doesn't mean that all sex is bad. One might decide to have sex in order to procreate, which is a civic good, and hence perhaps a virtue. Sex might be used to nurture marital affection, another good. Such a sexual act, though, would have to be informed by a reasoned and correct judgment, not the physical passion that springs from a false judgment. I would suppose that true Stoics were not particularly good sexual partners. For Stoics, then, the ideal state is that of apatheia, having so mastered the rational abilities so that passions never arise. This is the ultimate goal and informs what it means to lead the good life. Always being in a calm state, not ruled by passions that arise from false judgments about what is truly good or bad. Only the sage reaches this state. The sage doesn't simply know reason and how to apply it, but basically embodies it. The Star Trek character Spock is modeled on this kind of figure, although Spock, unlike the Stoic sage, never had to work to achieve that level of rationality. Stoicism is mostly known today in its Roman form. Roman philosophers, or at least the more famous ones whose writings survived, tended to be less interested in the theoretical underpinnings of the system. Instead, they honed in on the useful bits. Philosophers in antiquity were overwhelmingly male and rich, mostly because it would have been easiest for them to acquire an education and to have the time necessary to teach, to read, and to write. In Rome and in the late Republic and in the Empire, such men moved in politically treacherous circles. Political alliances and the whims of the emperors shifted quickly, and backing the wrong party at the wrong time could be deadly. As in Putin's Russia, this caused no small amount of anxiety for those who could be vulnerable. Stoicism provided a useful resource for dealing with these negative emotions. Seneca is probably the best exemplar of Roman Stoicism. Born into a wealthy family in Spain around 4 BCE, perhaps the very year in which Jesus was born, he studied rhetoric, a common choice for the children of rich men who worked in civic and administrative positions. Later, making his way to Rome as a legal advocate and a member of the Senate, a role reserved not just for the most able but for the richest and most well-connected, he attended lectures of Stoic and Pythagorean philosophers. His skill, though, came to the attention of the imperial court, and he found himself in his late 30s or early 40s appointed as tutor to the young Prince Nero. Upon Nero's appointment as emperor, Seneca became his advisor. Eventually, and probably inevitably, he ran afoul within the court intrigue and was forced, much like Socrates, to take his own life. There was no shortage of later retellings and artistic depictions of this event, which made a deep cultural impact. Seneca was a prolific writer, mainly letters, short essays, and plays. Many of his favorite themes recur in each of these genres. One was the Stoic emphasis on our fundamental lack of control over our own fate. This is an exceedingly important cause of human suffering. Much of our angst is caused, he argues, by fretting about the past or the future. Seneca argues that there will be plenty of time to worry about the future in the future. Since we cannot know how the future will really turn out, though, no good comes of worrying about it now. You will suffer soon enough, he writes. So look forward, meanwhile, to better things. What shall you gain by doing this? Time. And later, we let ourselves drift with every breeze. We are frightened at uncertainties, just as if they were certain. Developing the ability to follow Seneca's advice and to put fears of the future at bay is no mean feat. We are psychologically built to worry. Sometimes this very worry can save our lives. Yet on the other hand, we know that the great bulk of our worries about the future are groundless and pointless. Even a small adjustment to the amount and extent of such worry might be beneficial. How do you do this? Another Stoic, no less than Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor from 161 to 190 CE, provides one example. Here is a man who, given the demands of administering an empire and waging battles, needed time and a bit more inner peace. He kept a notebook in which he wrote short reminders to himself to recall and apply Stoic lessons. Writing for him became a source of ascesis, literally training, the root of asceticism. We call his practice journaling. Some of these notebooks, although never intended for an outside readership, survived, and today his meditations can be read. They're neither profound nor self-revelatory, but they were never intended to be either. How do you remind yourself that we are small, insignificant creatures when seen against the cosmos, and that much of our fear is not productive or worthwhile? By writing that message to yourself again and again, until maybe it really does take root. Does it matter whether it really is true or not? The Stoics thus offer a model for understanding unhappiness and mitigating its effects. Recognizing what is and what is not under our control is the key lesson. When we cognitively realize, really realize, in a deep and fundamental way, that most things that upset us are outside of our control, then the unhappiness dissolves. We recognize it as a byproduct of our own reasoning mistakes. What is under our control, though, is our ability to master our thinking so that we are not drawn into those reasoning mistakes, and instead spend our energy cultivating virtue. This is a fine idea in theory, although, as we all know, far harder to implement in practice. Buddhism offers a related approach to unhappiness and its prescription. The basic root of unhappiness in Buddhist teachings are our tendencies to crave and cling. We crave food, sex, love, even existence itself, and we cling to our things and other people. We are constantly, existentially, in a state of desire and attachment. This state of attachment to the world is, like Stoicism, also a cognitive misperception. We simply fail to recognize the true nature of things. We mistake the self for something fixed, independent, and permanent, when Buddhist teaching sees it as impermanent, conditioned, and constantly changing. Everything we experience only through consciousness. Nothing actually exists outside of it. The basic framework of this teaching is encapsulated in what is known as the Four Noble Truths. Truth number 1. Ordinary human existence is pervaded by dukkha, suffering, dissatisfaction, unease, or unsatisfactoriness. Truth number 2. Suffering derives from attachment and craving. As long as we desire, we are bound to suffer. We will never get everything we desire, and we will inevitably lose those things to which we are attached. Before going on to the third noble truth, I want to pause here to acknowledge that actually, not all suffering is the result of attachment. There is physical suffering and suffering caused by external factors. Buddhists would not claim that physical pain is not real, but that we do have the power to shape how we perceive it. Facing a deadly and painful disease, for example, we might welcome and embrace it as a fitting test or punishment. In such a case, it might be best to separate pain, the physical sensation, from the mental response that we have to it. Back, though, to the third noble truth, which is that suffering can be alleviated by extinguishing desire and attachment. The state of being free of all attachment is known as nirvana. Finally, the fourth noble truth concerns how we reach nirvana, and that is known as the Noble Eightfold Path. The path emphasizes behaviors like proper speech and mindfulness. It is a kind of toolkit for helping a person to leave desire and attachment behind. In much modern discourse in the West, these and other Buddhist ideas are detached from its much greater theological context. At the core of this context is the belief that there is an eternal cycle of life, marked by reincarnation, reward, and punishment. There is a world awash in deities who can help or hurt us on our quest. Buddhist life is tied more to acts of piety than to an abstract philosophical system like the Stoics. These Buddhist teachings overlap with some modern forms of therapy, especially ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. ACT does not ask us to defeat painful thoughts or prove them false. It asks us to notice them, make room for them, loosen their grip, and still act in accordance with our values. Suffering is a truth. The problem is how to respond to it. As a therapeutic rather than a religious framework, ACT works to learn to accept and respond to the suffering in a helpful way rather than in a debilitating way. If someone has a fear of social situations, ACT might encourage him or her to acknowledge that fear and attend the social event nevertheless, because it would make a family member or spouse happy, thus helping them live by their values. This might lead to discomfort, but it is a healthier response than social isolation. ACT denies the Buddhist idea, at least as a practical matter, that there is a way out of suffering. In Theravada Buddhism, the liberated ideal is often called the Arhat or the Arhat. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Bodhisattva becomes the central ideal, one who seeks awakening not only for himself, but for the liberation of all beings. Some bodhisattvas become objects of intense devotion and veneration. Like the Stoic sage, very few can reach this stage. Unlike the sage, though, the bodhisattva reaches a celestial state, and later followers worship them, often through veneration of their images. Buddhist monks and nuns exemplify an extreme attempt to disattach from desire. Although some of the ascetic practices are similar to that of Christian monks and nuns, there are crucial differences. Christian monastics desire to be close with God. Desire is at the heart of their practice, with physical asceticism meant to help channel the desire toward a higher target. Buddhist monastic practice aims not to redirect desire toward God, but to loosen craving and attachment so that compassion and awakening become possible. So where does that leave us? Personally, I see the Stoic, Buddhist, and therapeutic approaches I've examined here as providing less a life orientation than a set of strategies that can help to mitigate my own suffering. Simply acknowledging that I have no control over the future, or that I can reframe an external setback or even physical pain in my own mind, is useful. It doesn't make the suffering go away, but it does put it into perspective and often takes the edge off. Detachment for me is unappealing as a way of life. Relationships and passion, even with all their drawbacks, are too important to me to want to give up. But I see the appeal. I sometimes find myself envying those whose lives seem to be calmer and more tranquil. Over these episodes, we have explored 4 ways of imagining the good life. Pleasure asks what we can enjoy. Virtue asks what kind of person we can become. Service asks whom or what we are willing to bind ourselves. Detachment asks what we can release. None of these is sufficient by itself. A good life may require some capacity for pleasure, some cultivation of virtue, some devotion to others, and some ability to let go. But most of us are normally drawn to commit more to one than to the others. And by doing so, we gain a powerful tool as we face the decisions ahead of us. If I know that I value service to my family over the pleasure of achievement, for example, some kinds of common career decisions become easier to make. The question I leave you with this week: How do you find peace? And what can you do moving forward to incorporate more or less of it into your own life? You're listening to Happiness and the Pursuit of the Good Life with me, Michael Sadlow. Readings, resources, and ways to support the podcast are available in the show notes and at mlsadlow.com. I welcome your questions and feedback.